Before the rise of the Imperium, before the legions marched, before the Emperor revealed his hand to the galaxy, there were the 10,000. They were not born in battle, nor bred for conquest. They were not cast from gene vats in bulk, nor trained as part of a legion. Each was crafted, shaped by the Emperor's own hand, not as soldiers, but as exemplars. Perfection was not a goal, it was the standard. The first custodians were made in silence, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in the vaults of the Emperor's earliest laboratories. The process was excruciating, precise, and singular. No two custodians were ever truly alike, for each was a work of art as much as a weapon. Entire lifetimes were spent refining one warrior. Thousands of aspirants perished for everyone who succeeded. Those who emerged stood taller than any man, minds sharpened by endless education, bodies sculpted by unmatched genetic craft. They were not the first superhuman warriors the Emperor made, but they were the most enduring. Among them was one who would be remembered above all others, Constantin Valdor. Whether he was truly the first is unknown, and even he never claimed it. But when the Custodians took shape, he stood at their head. The Emperor called him his spear. Valdor did not speak often. When he did, it was with precision. He did not need to explain his loyalty. It was as natural as breath. He stood at the Emperor's side as the first wars of unification began. He fought not for glory, but for necessity. He walked ahead of conquest, never behind it. In the early days of Terra's unification, the Emperor did not send armies without care. Where diplomacy might succeed, he sent envoys. Where war was certain, he sent forces. But where the outcome could not be left to chance, he sent the Custodians. They were fewer than 1,000 in those first campaigns, but their presence turned wars. Each Custodian was the equal of 100 men. In battle, they fought not in massed ranks, but as living weapons, precise and devastating. When they struck, it was with speed and finality. When they defended, not a step was lost. But their true role was never the battlefield. They were the Emperor's guardians, not just of his life, but of his intent. Where he walked, they walked. Where he stood, they stood behind him, watching, listening, ready. They were his voice when he chose silence, his shadow when he cast light. Unlike the Thunder Warriors who raged across Terra like storms, the Custodians moved with discipline and purpose. The Thunder Warriors were tools of war. The Custodians were guardians of the future. When the time came to end the Thunder Warriors, when they had served their purpose and grown unstable, it was not the Custodians who struck them down in rage or vengeance. It was done quietly, efficiently. There are those who say the Custodians mourned the Thunder Warriors in their own way. They had fought beside them. They had seen what unchecked ambition and flawed design could do. When the Thunder Warriors fell, the Custodians remained, unchanged, unbroken, eternal. Unlike the Astartes, who would one day be raised in thousands and sent to conquer the stars, the Custodians did not belong to any one legion or theater. They answered only to the Emperor, not to commanders, not to doctrine, not even to the High Lords who would come after. They were few by design. Quantity was weakness. Each Custodian bore within him centuries of experience, the knowledge of countless battles, and a mind sharpened to see beyond the limits of ordinary thought. They trained constantly, not merely to improve, but to maintain an impossible standard. Combat drills, philosophy, history, art, strategy, metaphysics, all were part of a Custodian's daily regimen. No single act, no detail, no decision was ever beneath their notice. They began the blood games before the rest of the Imperium even knew their name. These were not contests of strength, but tests of vigilance. Custodians would attempt to infiltrate the Imperial Palace, to exploit their own weaknesses, to prove that no system, no guard, No protocol was beyond failure, and when they failed, they studied. When they succeeded, they made it harder next time. They did not crave battle. They did not seek honor. They sought readiness. The Emperor entrusted them not only with his life, but with his silence. When he needed no voice, they stood in his stead. When he passed judgment, they carried it out. When he vanished from sight, they ensured that his will remained known. It is said that in those earliest days, entire nations surrendered at the mere sight of them. That envoys from distant lands, hardened by decades of war, dropped to their knees when faced with a single custodian in gold. Not because of fear, but because of understanding. They were not looking at men. They were looking at the end of resistance. To meet a custodian was to be seen in full. Their gaze measured more than weapons or armies. They judged intent. They knew lies before they were spoken. They stood as both sword and scale. The first of the 10,000 did not call themselves heroes. They did not raise banners or wear the emblems of victory. Their armor bore only the aquila and the light of the Emperor's purpose. And though they were few, the world changed beneath their watch. When the Unification Wars ended and Terra bent its knee, when the Emperor raised his eyes to the stars and prepared to conquer them, the Custodians were already prepared. They had no need for ceremony, no need for glory. They had always been ready. They were the first of the 10,000. Terra, before the Imperium, was a shattered ruin. The bones of ancient empires lay buried beneath ash, buried beneath arrogance, buried beneath blood. For millennia, the planet that had once ruled the stars was reduced to a carcass picked clean by warlords, gene tyrants, and techno-barbarian kings. Each city was a fortress, each fortress a throne, each throne contested in fire and betrayal. It was not one world, but 10,000 petty fiefdoms stitched across deserts and oceans with barbed wire and orbital mines. The skies wept radiation, the oceans frothed with toxins. Titans once built to terraform entire systems now served as the idols of madmen. Across the Himalayan plateaus, plasma storms danced through cracked ozone. In the Afric fortress, steel gods were worshipped by post-human priesthoods who consumed knowledge like meat. And yet through all of it, humanity endured, barely, stubbornly, furiously. Into this madness came the Emperor, not as a conqueror, not at first, but as a redeemer. He walked from myth into fire, wrapped in golden light, bearing neither crown nor title. But his presence was undeniable. He did not speak of destiny. He did not need to. Where he tread, even the mad paused. His words did not demand submission. They made it inevitable. But words alone could not unify the broken. And so the Emperor brought war. At his back, two forces emerged to bring Terra to heel. The first was the Legion of Thunder, gene-forged warriors built for speed, strength, and violence. The Thunder Warriors, clad in thunderbolt-marked armor, they were fury incarnate, sweeping across the fractured wastes in brutal, unstoppable assaults. The second force was smaller, quieter, older. The Custodians. Gold against gray, precision against rage. They did not fight wars. They ended them. Where the Thunder Warriors broke gates, the Custodians ensured no one escaped through the cracks. The Emperor wielded both, but not equally. The Thunder Warriors were hammers. The Custodians were scalpels. From the Ice Helix clans of the Nordic Wastes to the Pan-Pacific Empire and the gene cults of Panasia, the campaign was merciless. The Emperor moved like a storm front, continent by continent, dismantling dynasties that had ruled for centuries in a matter of weeks. One of the first major conquests was the techno-barbarian state of Ursh. Ruled by the warlord Caligan, a psychic tyrant who claimed divinity, Ursh controlled much of Eurasia. Its armies were vast, their weapons horrifying. plasma artillery that could vaporize cities, gene hounds bred for assassination, teleportation arrays carved from the remnants of Dark Age science. Callaghan believed he was untouchable. He had defeated rivals with ease and bent sorcerers to his will. But belief is fragile. When the Emperor came to Ursh, he brought no diplomatic envoy, no demands for parley, only the Custodians and war. At the gates of the phallic citadel, Callaghan's capital, a single Custodian walked forward alone. His name is lost, his armor shattered, his deeds remembered in silence. He spoke only once. "You are finished." What followed was the fall of an empire in a single day. The Thunder Warriors struck from the air, plasma bursts lighting the dusk in crimson arcs. Callaghan's dread automata were hacked apart by blades of gold, and amidst it all, the Custodians moved like shadows, cutting down psychic adepts with clinical efficiency. One was said to have faced 6 of Callaghan's personal guard, warriors enhanced beyond human limits, and slain them all in less time than it took to say his name. When Callaghan died, pierced through the heart by a golden spear, the throne he had carved from human bone crumbled to dust. The message was clear. There would be no kings but one. Elsewhere, resistance took different forms. The Pan-Pacific Alliance fought to the last. Their warriors were post-human, cybernetic hybrids, bred to live underwater and strike from the sea. Their cities lay beneath the ocean, shielded by walls of pressure and weaponized algae that could consume steel. The Thunder Warriors could not reach them, but the Custodians could. Donning pressure-sealed armor designed in secret by the Mechanicum's forerunners, small units of Custodians descended into the depths. What followed was a silent war, fought in darkness beneath miles of crushing water. One by one, the Alliance domes fell. No broadcasts, no cries for help, just silence. When the Custodians emerged, they were bloodied, dented, but victorious. The Alliance surrendered without terms. There was no one left to negotiate. The campaign of unification was not without tragedy. The Thunder Warriors, for all their strength, were flawed. Their genetic stability deteriorated faster than anyone expected. Rage grew in them, uncontrollable, corrosive. In time, many of them began to question the Emperor, not out of disloyalty, but confusion. Why were they being replaced? Why were they dying? The final insult came not from the battlefield, but from the Emperor's silence. He had already begun creating new warriors, the Astartes. The Thunder Warriors were no longer needed. At the height of their despair, some plotted rebellion. Others begged for answers. A few simply broke. What happened next is debated, whispered, never officially recorded. But the truth is this. The Thunder Warriors were purged, some by assassination, some by manufactured war, some by direct confrontation, and in at least one instance, on the slopes of Mount Ararat, it was the Custodians who carried it out. Valdor himself is said to have been present when a battalion of Thunder Warriors led by a warlord named Ushotan refused disarmament. The Custodians descended. The battle was brief. Ushotan died with his blade buried in Valdor's pauldron, but the Captain General did not fall. His counterstrike ended Ushotan in a single, perfect motion. The mountain ran red. When it was done, Valdor reportedly turned to a Thunder Warrior who had survived the fighting and said only, "You were magnificent." Then he turned and walked away. It was not hatred, it was necessity. With the Thunder Warriors gone, Terra was unified in truth. The Emperor stood atop the ruins of a fractured world and proclaimed the birth of the Imperium. Not a dream, not a hope, a command. The Custodians did not celebrate. Their role was not to cheer, but to guard. As the Emperor gathered scientists, scholars, and geneticists to build his next project, the Legions Astartes, the Custodians watched. As the great palaces and cathedrals of Terra were constructed, the Custodians patrolled their unfinished halls. And when the Emperor spoke of the stars, of the need to reclaim mankind's birthright among the galaxy, the Custodians made preparations. But they did not forget Terra. They had walked its poisoned fields. They had waded through its blood-soaked cities. They had killed not for conquest, but to prepare a cradle for something greater. The unification of Terra was not a war, it was a cleansing, and the Custodians were the scalpel that carved the rot away. When it was over, the Custodians did not rest. They sharpened their blades. They watched the stars. They waited. The stars had always belonged to humanity. In the age before darkness, before the warp swallowed the heavens and shattered mankind's unity, there had been glory among the stars. Golden ships drifted between systems like gods on pilgrimage. Technology served, never ruled. Planets were cradles, not battlegrounds. Then came the fall. Warp storms, madness, silence. Mankind became a refugee in its own empire. Worlds were lost to isolation. Civilizations turned inward, feral, broken. Some forgot they were ever part of a greater whole. Others remembered only hate. When Terra was whole again, when the last tyrants lay dead and the thunder quieted, the Emperor turned his gaze outward. Not in wonder, not in nostalgia, but in cold, burning purpose. The stars were broken. He would make them whole. The Great Crusade began not with ceremony, but with deployment. The fleets rose from Terra like spears cast into the void. Thousands of ships, each bearing the Aquila. Entire divisions of freshly forged space marines. The Astartes, 20 legions, bred for war and nothing else. Mechanicum constructs, engine priests, logisticians, remembrancers, scribes, an entire empire in motion. But at the heart of it all, cloaked in silence, moved a force that answered to no lord, no legion, no primarch. The Custodians. They were not soldiers in the conventional sense. Their presence in the crusade was never about numbers, rarely more than a few dozen deployed at a time, sometimes only one. But where they walked, the Emperor's shadow walked with them. When the first fleets struck out beyond Sol, he went with them. Not as a commander, not as an overseer. He walked as a creator reclaiming his design. And wherever he went, his golden guardians encircled him like the rings of a star. The early conquests of the Crusade were not battles, they were resurrections. On Luna, the techno-clans knelt after only a single demonstration of the Custodians' power. A surgical elimination of the Gene priesthood's ruling triad, performed without a word. By the time the final gunfire echoed off the lunar spires, the Mechanicum was offering its loyalty and its forges to the Emperor's cause. In the outer colonies, where human worlds had devolved into empires ruled by warlords and tyrants, the Custodians served as the Emperor's blade. They did not make war. They removed obstacles. On the world of Gyros Thravian, the Emperor met a civilization that had survived Old Night through rigid caste hierarchy and psychic tyranny. Its rulers were pariahs, soulless creatures who drained the warp's presence from the air itself. When diplomacy failed, a single custodian, his name not recorded, only his actions, was sent to speak with their leader. He entered the throne citadel unarmed. 3 hours later, the ruler was dead, the palace empty, the city silent. There were no signs of struggle, only absence. When the Emperor arrived the next day, the people were already on their knees. This was the nature of the Great Crusade in its earliest years. A reawakening, a realignment. The stars did not know yet to resist. The Custodians rarely stayed. Once order was established, once the Emperor's will was secured, they returned to him. They were never stationed. They had no need for garrisons. Their mission was the Emperor, not the map. When the first of the Lost Sons was found, the Custodians were there. It was Leman Russ who emerged first, feral, wild, iron-hearted, a wolf in the skin of a man. When the Emperor descended onto Fenris, it was not a diplomatic envoy that accompanied him. It was the 10,000, armored in auramite, weapons sheathed but ready. The chieftains of Fenris saw them standing motionless in the snow, radiant even in the storm, and knew that their world had changed forever. Every time a Primarch was found, whether it was the philosopher Robut, the pale horror Conrad, or the angelic Sanguinius, the Custodians were the silent bridge between father and son. They did not advise, they did not interfere, but their presence reminded each Primarch who their creator was. They were the quiet authority in every chamber, the ones who needed no seat at the table to rule its direction. As the Astartes legions grew, marched and triumphed across the stars, the Custodians observed. It was not envy that filled them, nor rivalry. It was pride, perhaps, but distant, detached. The Space Marines were instruments of war. They were siblings, brothers in arms, commanders and conquerors. The Custodians were something else. They were legacy. They served the Emperor directly, personally, always. They had fought beside him in the unification of Terra. They had guarded him in the halls of the palace when no one knew his name. And now they walked with him between the stars, unseen by many, but always near. Sometimes they moved ahead of the crusade. The eyes of the Emperor, a hidden division within the Custodian Guard, performed operations so secret even many legions were unaware of them. Their missions were not recorded, their successes unacknowledged, but the results were felt. A world that surrendered before the first ship entered orbit, a rebellion that collapsed before it began, a cult that vanished without trace days before the Mechanicum's data vaults were installed. The eyes worked alone or in pairs. They wore the colors of other armies, disguised their voices, hid their faces, but always they carried the Emperor's will. One such operative, known only by the title Alecto, was dispatched to a distant mining world in Segmentum Tempestus. The population had long worshipped a pre-imperial artificial intelligence. The arrival of the Crusade risked igniting open revolt. Alecto arrived 2 weeks early. When the legions descended, they found the cult dismantled, the AI core shattered, and the people waiting for their new masters with bowed heads and empty hands. No one ever asked how. No one needed to. The Great Crusade swelled. Tens of thousands of worlds fell into compliance. But with every victory, the distance between the Emperor and the front grew greater. It was inevitable. When the triumph of Ulanor came, the greatest celebration the Imperium had yet known, commemorating the defeat of the largest Orc empire in history. It marked not just an end, but a turning. The Emperor stood before the legions, flanked by his sons, shining in glory. The Custodians stood behind him, impassive, eternal. And then he announced his withdrawal. Horus would take command. The Emperor would return to Terra. Many were stunned. Few dared speak. But the Custodians did not waver. They knew the Emperor's will was never spoken lightly. And so they returned to Terra with him. But not all. A fraction remained, assigned to observe the legions, to ensure the Emperor's word was not diluted in his absence. These Custodians were not commanders. They offered no advice, but their presence was enough to remind even the proudest Primarchs that they were sons, not kings. The Custodians became the memory of the Emperor, scattered among the stars, his voice when he no longer spoke, his gaze when he no longer watched. Back on Terra, the Golden Throne called. Deep beneath the palace, the Webway Project had begun, an effort to break humanity's reliance on the warp, to create a new path through the stars, clean and safe. The Emperor needed peace, time, focus. The Custodians became his shield, his silence, his solitude. The galaxy turned, the legions marched on, and and far from the light, darkness began to whisper. But the Custodians, as ever, listened and waited. They had seen empires rise. They had walked with gods. They had silenced kings. Now, in the quiet halls of terror and the echoing void of space, they prepared for something they could not yet name. Because even in victory, they saw it. A shadow, growing. Prospero was not like other worlds. It did not bleed war from its soil or ring with the forge hymns of conquest. It was not a fortress. It was a place of thought. Towers of glass and blackstone stretched toward the stars like fingers searching for answers. Libraries swam with scentless paper and glowing script. Scholars debated the nature of reality beneath stained glass suns. This was the realm of Magnus the Red, the Cyclops, the Sorcerer, the Primarch who spoke in tongues no mortal mouth should shape and who dreamed not of dominion, but of understanding. It was also the next battleground of betrayal. The roots of the tragedy lie in silence and pride, first from Magnus, then from the Emperor. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns was brilliant beyond reckoning, a master of the immaterium, a weaver of truths so deep that even his brothers feared what he might uncover. He believed knowledge was salvation, that mankind's future lay not in brute strength, but in unlocking the full potential of the human soul. But power has a price, and knowledge burns. Magnus had been warned by the Emperor himself. The Edict of Nicaea had been clear. No more sorcery, no more meddling in the warp. The cost was too great. The walls between reality and madness too thin. But Magnus, ever the loyal son in his own mind, defied the command. He saw catastrophe rising, a storm coiled in the eye of terror, and he tried to warn his father. He shattered the veil to do it, tore through the warp like a thunderclap. And in doing so, he ruptured the Emperor's greatest secret, his webway project, buried beneath the Imperial Palace. The psychic backlash broke its foundations. Demons spilled in like floodwater. The Emperor, deep in meditation, screamed, not in pain, but in betrayal. And he answered. Retribution came not in words, but in orders. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, was dispatched to Prospero. Not alone. The order did not come with subtlety. The Custodians would walk beside him. And not just them, also the Sisters of Silence, those mute anathemas, nulls to all psychic influence. Together they would bring Magnus to Terra, for judgment, for obedience, for penance. At least that was the original command. But somewhere along the way the message changed. Russ was not just a warrior, he was a predator. He was also a tool, sharp, violent, and easy to aim. The whisper came from Horus, trusted war master, already lost to chaos. He told Russ the truth was different, that Magnus had turned fully, that there would be no redemption, that the Emperor had commanded not retrieval, but execution, and Russ, proud and wrathful, believed it. The fleets gathered, the route charted, the Custodians prepared. Among them was a detachment of seasoned warriors who had once walked the hidden paths of the galaxy, eyes of the Emperor and companions to his person. Now they bore new orders, oversee the censure of a Primarch, ensure compliance, secure the Emperor's interests. They did not question that was not their purpose. They arrived in the orbit of Prospero to find a world unguarded. No fleets, no defenses raised, no preparations for war. Magnus had not rallied his legion. He had not summoned allies. He had done nothing. He was waiting. But the order had changed. Drop pods fell from the sky like iron rain. The wolves howled across the city's crystal towers. The sisters moved in silence, blanketing the battlefield in a haze that choked the warp from the air. The Custodians followed behind, not as allies, not as conquerors, but as something colder. Judges, witnesses. What they found was not a legion prepared for war, but a people caught unaware. The The Thousand Sons fought regardless. They fought with desperation, with terror, with fury born of disbelief. Their homes shattered beneath them, their monuments crumbled. Civilians died by the thousands, caught in the crossfire. Spire by spire, Tisca fell. The Custodians moved with merciless precision. They targeted psychers, not warriors, librarians, not generals. Their objective was not territorial conquest, it was suppression, eradication of contamination, control of knowledge. In the Hall of Translators, where scrolls hung like lanterns in threads of stasis field light, a custodian squad executed every scholar within. The words they carried could no longer be trusted. The warp had already tainted the ink. In the pyramid of Photep, a detachment led by Shield Captain Lamun Tar found a group of Thousand Sons attempting to erect a psychic ward to shield wounded. He cut them down. The sick, too. Their souls had already burned, he said, and at the center of it all stood Valdor. Constantine Valdor, the spear of the Emperor. He had known Magnus, had spoken with him in the early days of the Crusade, had once debated philosophy with the Cyclops beneath the light of twin moons. But Valdor did not flinch. His mission was not to understand, it was to enforce. It was said he entered the Pyramid of Narthex alone, that he faced 7 of Magnus's inner cabal, sorcerers who had once illuminated entire star systems with their power, and slew them without uttering a single word. His blade moved faster than sound. His armor reflected not light, but intention. When he emerged, he bore a single scroll. He handed it to a custodian archivist, unread. Later, it would be incinerated. Russ fought his own war, chasing Magnus through the wreckage of his world. The 2 Primarchs clashed in a battle that bent the sky. At the end, Magnus shattered, body broken, spirit torn open, and vanished into the warp. Whether he fled or was taken is a matter of belief. Tisca burned. The Thousand Sons were slaughtered. Their legion scattered, broken, or gone. Prospero became a grave. The Custodians did not celebrate. They gathered their dead in silence, catalogued what remained, destroyed what was deemed too dangerous to return. They left behind only ash and the echo of screams. Some among them questioned quietly. Had the mission been perverted? Had justice become slaughter? But questions were not their burden. Duty was. When they returned to Terra, they brought with them knowledge not found in any report. They carried the weight of a war that should not have been a war. They carried the guilt of obedience. The Emperor said nothing of it. No commendation, no condemnation, only silence. And the work beneath the palace continued. The Webway project faltered. The Golden Throne consumed him, and the Custodians resumed their watch. But none forgot Prospero. Not the survivors, not the guilty, not the 10,000. Some memories never fade. They smolder, far beneath the gleaming towers of the Imperial Palace, deeper than the vaults of the gene labs and the catacombs of saints. There lies a realm that was never meant to be known by the Imperium's people. A place not of stone or steel, but of shifting dimensions, impossible angles, and silent corridors where space folds like paper and time drips like oil. The Webway. Not a creation of mankind, but an inheritance. The Eldari had built it long before the rise of Terra's first kings. An infinite labyrinthine network of tunnels stretching between stars, hidden within the folds of real space. It was a realm outside the warp, a corridor through the void that did not suffer the storms, the demons, the madness. And the Emperor, in his grand design, had sought to take it. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. The Webway could not be seized by force. Its dimensions resisted intrusion. Its pathways shifted to defend themselves. What he attempted instead was creation. A human-made interface, a gate between Terra and the stars, bypassing the warp forever. A future where mankind would no longer need psychers to guide ships, no longer rely on the Imperium's fragile and treacherous psychic leash. It was to be his greatest triumph. Greater than the Thunder Warriors, greater than the legions, a vision that would outlast even him. To carve such a path required unthinkable effort. The throne beneath the palace, the so-called Golden Throne, was not a mere seat of power. It was a machine beyond comprehension, a fusion of psychic force and ancient technology that allowed the Emperor to hold a fraction of the webway open. Every moment he sat upon it, he waged a silent war against the unreality pressing in around it. But even gods can be interrupted. When Magnus the Red shattered the veil, the psychic blow ripped open a breach within the webway, a tear that allowed the demonic tide access to the very roots of Terra. The Emperor, bound to the throne, could not leave. The golden figure who had once strode through stars, who had burned tyrants to ash with a glance, was now trapped, not by chains but by necessity. So the Custodians took his place. The war in the webway was never witnessed by the outside world. There are no records of it in the Librarium archives. No remembrancers painted the battles. No bards sang of the sieges. And yet, it was perhaps the most critical conflict in human history. Because if Terra had fallen there, if even one demonic host had reached the surface from below, there would have been no siege of the palace, no throne to defend, no Imperium to mourn. It began with a whisper, a crack in the boundary, just wide enough for the first horrors to bleed through. The demons did not march. They did not storm. They poured like spilled nightmares. The tunnels of the webway ran red and black, twisted by unreality. Screaming mouths grew from walls, lights flickered with malice, physics warped with every step. And into this, the Custodians entered. Not with banners, not with legions. There were no massed formations in the webway, no reserves, no reinforcements. Only squads, sometimes pairs, sometimes individuals, each tasked with holding a corridor, defending a nexus, pushing into impossible terrain where the ground itself hated their presence. They fought without rest. There was no time. The first weeks were chaos. The demonic hordes were endless. The Custodians killed by the score, but for everyone they struck down, 10 more emerged from the mists. Some were familiar, the gibbering servants of Sinch, the brass-clad berserkers of Khorne. Others had no names, shifting protean things that defied form, born of dreams that had never been dreamt. And yet the 10,000 endured. One squad under Shield Captain Andros Itan held a single junction for 23 days. 23 days without sleep, without retreat, without relief. They used every stratagem, war rites, kill zones, teleport denial fields. Their armor was scorched and weeping, their blades dulled and bloodied. When relief finally came, it was not with reinforcements, but with collapse. The junction's walls finally gave in, sealing themselves with warp-reactive ferrocrete. Andros Itan was the only one left standing. He did not speak for 3 weeks. Elsewhere, the Sisters of Silence walked into the dark. Pariahs, blanks, their mere presence was a weapon, snuffing out the warp like a candle in vacuum. They fought alongside the Custodians, not with martial prowess, but with negation. Demons faltered in their presence, recoiled as if scalded. Where the sisters walked, the warp retreated. It was said that a trio of them once stood alone in a vast cathedral corridor for 9 hours, holding back an entire legion of shrieking demons. When reinforcements arrived, the sisters were drenched in ichor but untouched. They bowed once and resumed their patrol. There were other allies, though the word hardly fits. Tech priests from Mars, trusted few, operated the defenses of the webway gate itself. Their minds were half machine, half prayer, locked in constant computation and ritual. Some would die simply from proximity to the demonic presence. Others welcomed it, mistaking it for machine spirit. Those who erred were swiftly corrected, sometimes by blade, sometimes by flame. The Custodians allowed no compromise, no weakness, no doubt. They could not afford it, and still the Emperor fought. His psychic will held the webway gate together, his mind bleeding into the mechanism, burning through countless psychers used as foci and amplifiers. Each day cost him more of himself. Each night, if such things existed down there, was filled with screams that echoed not through ears, but through thoughts. One custodian, Sagatar Orfiel, stood guard directly outside the throne for months without stepping away. His armor fused with the floor, his weapon never lowered. When asked why he never rested, he replied only once, "The Emperor does not sleep. Why should I?" Time in the webway meant nothing. Hours became years. Days bled into seconds. Custodians lost track of everything but the next strike, the next breach, the next daemon. And then, slowly, the tide began to falter. No great victory, no final battle, simply a tightening of the breach. The Emperor's will, terrible and radiant, burned ever brighter. The demons began to scream not in fury, but in fear. Corridors once choked with madness began to clear. The light returned, not the glow of plasma, but the golden light of the master of mankind's fury. The Custodians pushed forward. They reclaimed halls, secured junctions, cleansed nexus points with ritual and fire. In time, the breach was sealed. The Webway War did not end, but the invasion did. The cost, however, was absolute. The Golden Throne had become a prison. The Emperor could never leave it again. The damage was too great. The price of sealing the breach had been the sacrifice of his mobility, his voice, his agency. And the Custodians who had once walked beside a living god now stood beside a husk of power, still mighty, still radiant, but silent. They said nothing. They did not weep. They stood, because that is what they were made to do. The Webway War was never recorded. It was never commemorated. No statues were raised. No triumph was held. The people of Terra never knew how close they came to annihilation from beneath their very feet. Only the Custodians remembered. They remember the silence, the screams, the moments when the veil nearly broke. The moment they held the line, not for glory, but because failure would have meant extinction. And they remember what it cost him. The Emperor had always stood above humanity. Now he sat, forever. And the 10,000 stood around him, unchanging, unyielding, immortal. Not because they were told to, but because there was no one else left who could. The betrayal did not begin with fire. It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the hush that precedes collapse. The stillness before an empire begins to unravel from within. It did not come with a scream, but with a whisper. A word shared between brothers, a hand held behind a back, a lie told often enough to become prophecy. By the time the first blade was drawn, it was already too late. The legions, once the Emperor's great hope, had grown vast. 20 brotherhoods of demigods, each forged in their father's image. They had brought worlds to heal, crushed Xeno's empires, and raised the Aquila across 100,000 stars. But in their greatness, there was fracture, pride, secrets, and somewhere in the dark, chaos waited with open arms. The Custodians saw it coming. Not in full, not in clarity, but they saw something. A shift, a deviation in the pattern. They felt it in the way certain Primarchs spoke less of unity and more of dominion. They saw it in the unease of warriors who should have had no fear, in the way the warp trembled beneath what should have been quiet systems. They whispered concerns to the Sigillite. They filed silent reports beneath the palace. And when the storm broke, they were already moving. It began in the stars, but the echoes reached Terra quickly. Word came from the fringes of Ultramar, of legion turning upon legion, of the word-bearers murdering their allies, of entire fleets disappearing from the void. And then, from Kalth to Istvan, the truth emerged. Horus Lupercal, the favored son, had turned. The War Master had fallen. The Imperium reeled, staggered, and then braced. The Great Crusade ended not with triumph, but with knives in the dark. But the heresy would not begin on Terra. Not yet. It would begin on Luna. The moon had always been a stronghold, its surface pocked with defensive batteries, sensor nets, void shield generators, and manufactories built directly into the stone. It was the outer shell of Terra's heart, its first line of defense, the sentry that never slept. And within it were allies thought incorruptible. The Legio Custodes had worked alongside the Luna garrisons for years. Many of the Emperor's gene labs, secrets, and reserves were housed there, projects too volatile or sacred to leave exposed on Terra itself. The Sisters of Silence maintained vaults of forbidden knowledge beneath the Mare Tranquillitatis. The Mechanicum oversaw dark forges beneath the Archimedes Ridge, and the Custodians patrolled it all, ever watchful. But Horus had learned, and Horus had planned. He struck without warning. Elements of the traitor legions, disguised under friendly transponder codes, infiltrated Luna's defense perimeter in the dead of the void. The Alpha Legion, ever the masters of deception, walked freely through access gates before striking. The word-bearers deployed cults already seated within the lunar workforce. And the sons of Horus, once the pride of the Imperium, descended like wolves upon their own kin. The first alarms triggered just before lunar midnight. By then, it was already a war. The Custodians did not panic. They did not retreat. They responded with the full fury of their purpose. Shield Captain Remas Ilvac led a detachment stationed near the southern pole. Vault Guardians assigned to an ancient relic buried deep within a crater complex. When the first explosions rocked the upper manufactories, he did not wait for command. He ordered full armor deployment, activated the watch protocols, and began surgical purges of access tunnels suspected to be compromised. He did not waste time with warnings. Treachery required no trial. Elsewhere, the Sisters of Silence moved without speaking. Entire lunar colonies fell into silence as they advanced, warp communications cut, psychic echoes vanishing into void. Cult activity died instantly in their presence. Demonic manifestations flickered and collapsed, but even their powers had limits. On the third day, the gates to the North Processing Bastion ruptured, not from external attack, but from within. Legions of servitors, corrupted by Mechanicum heretics loyal to Mars schismatics, turned on their masters. Defense turrets reprogrammed, Vox systems distorted, coordinates for orbital bombardments quietly rewritten. It was sabotage on a scale never seen before. It was betrayal in every corridor. And yet the Custodians held. They moved like golden comets through the underhalls of the moon. Every squad became a bulwark, every lone warrior a citadel. They fought without backup, without hope of reinforcement. They did not ask for aid. They did not retreat to regroup. They stood. One custodian, Ankar Velith, was found later, alone, buried beneath 4 meters of collapsed ferrocrete, surrounded by the bodies of 80 enemy combatants. His weapon arm had been severed, his visor cracked, but he had never stopped moving forward. He was still alive when they dug him out. Elsewhere, Valdor himself led an orbital strike against a captured communications hub near the Mare Imbrium. He did not speak to his warriors. He did not rally them with speeches. He simply pointed. And where he pointed, the enemy died. For every victory the traitors gained, they paid in oceans of blood. But victory was never their goal. The battle was not meant to win the moon. It was meant to distract, to bleed, to draw the Custodians out, away from the true heart, Terra. By the time the final word-bearer gunship was driven into the lunar dust, the price had been paid. Thousands of custodians were dead, dozens of gene labs destroyed. The northern moon crater arrays, once home to psychic amplifiers, lay gutted and silent. But the traitors had not reached the gates of Terra. They had hoped to kill the 10,000 in transit. They failed, and now the Custodians knew what was coming. Valdor convened the High Sigillite. Preparations accelerated. The Saturnine Gate was reinforced. The walls of the palace reshaped. The blood games, once theoretical, now ran continuously, not as drills, but as predictions. Traitor tactics were modeled, infiltration scenarios replayed daily. Terra was becoming a fortress. Not a world, not a capital, a last stand. But the Custodians did not despair. They had always been outnumbered. They had always been alone. And yet they had never broken. As ships fled from the edge of the Imperium, as worlds burned and legions crumbled, the 10,000 stood in silence beneath the stars. They did not look outward. Their duty was here. They did not mourn the dead of Luna. They did not curse the traitors. They simply cleaned their blades and waited. The walls of the Imperial Palace had never been designed to keep out men. They were made to hold back gods. Crafted over decades, carved from mountain ranges, and reinforced with materials dredged from the forgotten depths of Mars, the palace was not a building. It was a bastion, a world-spanning fortress that stretched from the snow-blasted peaks of the Himalayan mountains to the fractured shores of the Pan-Pacific Trench. Its foundations were laid upon the bones of the old knight, its spires taller than the clouds. Every inch had been prepared. Every wall, every turret, every gate was designed to bleed armies dry. No mere siege could hope to take it. But Horus had not come with a mere army. He had brought half the Imperium. It began as a storm across the void. The traitor fleet arrived like a second sun, 1,000 ships burning in low orbit, spitting fire upon the ground below. The sky above Terra turned black as ash and filled with screaming debris. Firestorms raged across the outer reaches of the throne world. Orbital stations shattered, civilian districts crumbled into radioactive craters, and still the palace stood. Inside, the Custodians prepared not as warriors, but as sentinels at the edge of eternity. This was not war as the legions knew it. It was not about flanking maneuvers, encirclement, or tactical withdrawals. This was not a battlefield. This was a crucible. The 10,000 had long known their purpose. From the day they were forged in the hidden vaults of Terra, they had trained not for conquest, but for this. Not for battlefields, but for the last stand. They were not made to take worlds. They were made to ensure that Terra, above all, would never fall. They were the final answer. The outer walls were the first to be tested. The Saturnine Gate, the Lion's Gate, the Eternity Wall. Names now etched in myth. The Sons of Horus led the charge, supported by the Iron Warriors' siege engines and the frenzied onslaught of the World Eaters. Titans strode across the blasted plains, each footfall a tectonic wound. Dozens of traitor legions hurled themselves against the adamantine bastions like waves crashing upon stone, and the stone held. The Custodians did not wait in chambers. They stood upon the battlements, shoulder to shoulder with the remaining Imperial fists, with the Sisters of Silence, with the ragged remnants of shattered Loyalist forces. But it was the 10,000 who bore the brunt. When walls broke, they stepped forward. When lines faltered, they filled the gaps. They fought not with fury, but with precision. Where the Astartes were whirlwinds of war, the Custodians were the still point in the storm. Each strike of their blades was final. Each movement calculated, honed through centuries of discipline. One Custodian did not hold a line. He became the line. They were tireless, without sleep, without fear, Shield Captain Trajan Aurelius held the Ashen Bastion for 13 consecutive days, surrounded on all sides. His armor scorched, his spear broken. He wielded a bolter in one hand and a storm shield in the other. He did not fall. Not even when daemons broke through the veil and surged across the walls in waves of madness. He held, until reinforcements finally reached him. They found only piles of the dead, and Aurelius, kneeling, praying without words before the Emperor's banner. The Custodians were not untouched by loss. Many fell, some were burned alive by demonic fire, others torn apart by warped machines. But they did not retreat, not once. They had sworn oaths not in blood, but in essence. Their deaths were not sacrifices, they were inevitabilities, measured, accepted, and embraced without hesitation. At the foot of the Eternity Gate, it was not the armies of the traitors that broke the defense. It was the sheer weight of desperation. The Emperor had long remained within the confines of the inner sanctum, tethered to the Golden Throne, overseeing what remained of the Webway project. But as the final gates began to shake under the pressure of the enemy, he stirred, and with him the Custodians changed. They withdrew subtly, purposefully, reassigning squads from the outer trenches to the inner spires. Some thought they were abandoning their posts, but they were not retreating. They were preparing, because there were lines that could never be allowed to break. And the chamber of the Golden Throne was the last. Beneath the Sanctum Imperialis, the Custodians took up positions that had never been used. Doorways that had never been opened were unsealed. Kill zones designed 5 centuries earlier were finally activated. Auto turrets, once hidden in gilded statues, came to life. And the 10,000 stood ready, not to fight for territory or victory, but to ensure that if the Imperium died, it would not die with its back turned. They were joined by the Sisters of Silence. Their null fields created psychic dead zones around the Golden Throne. No demonic whisper could penetrate. No psychic eye could see within. The Custodians did not speak to them. They did not need to. Their coordination was absolute, their purpose unified. It was during these hours, the darkest before the dawn, that the Custodians became something more than guardians. They became myth. Eyewitness accounts, what few exist, speak of squads of Custodians teleporting into crumbling sanctums mere seconds before collapse, extracting wounded by hand. Others tell of Custodians standing against entire enemy companies, outnumbered 100 to 1, and holding firm until reinforcements arrived. One such tale tells of Custodian Econ Targoris, who alone held the gate to the throne room while the Emperor communed with his final loyal sons. Covered in ash, blood, and soot, Targoris did not move for 6 hours. His heart had stopped, but his body did not fall. He was buried where he stood. As the siege raged, the Custodians adapted. They learned the patterns of their traitor kin. They memorized enemy generals' movements. They began anticipating attacks before they came, not through intelligence, but through instinct, through familiarity born of ancient vigilance. When Sanguinius fell and the Emperor finally rose from the throne, the Custodians moved with him, not as warriors now, but as witnesses. They followed him to the final confrontation, not to interfere, but to ensure that what happened was preserved, burned into reality, untampered, unaltered. And when the Emperor struck down Horus in that final, terrible moment, when the galaxy broke and was born again in blood, the Custodians were there, silent, solemn. They carried him back, not as a god, but as a father, broken by the hand of his favorite son. The war did not end in victory. It ended in survival. And the 10,000 once scattered across stars, once silent shadows behind the Emperor's stride, now stood alone atop a broken world. Their purpose had changed. No longer guardians of a living god, they became sentinels of a dying one. But they did not waver. They raised their blades again, because the walls of the palace may have stood. But the galaxy was falling. There are wars that are fought with fire, there are wars that are fought with lies, and then there are wars that are fought with time. The siege of Terra had ended, but there was no peace. There was only stillness, raw, unnatural, and echoing with the aftermath of something too vast to comprehend. The Emperor, once radiant and untouchable, now sat broken upon the golden throne, his body ruined, his voice silenced, his will bound to a machine that drank 1,000 souls a day just to keep his essence flickering. The Age of Grief began not with rebellion or revelation, but with routine. Days folded into months, months into years. The galaxy burned with civil war, and yet the palace remained cold, methodical, exacting. And the Custodians did not move. They had been the Emperor's blades, the tip of his will. They had walked at his side from the gene forges of Terra to the gates of demonic realms. Now they stood guard over a silent god, in golden halls that no longer echoed with his step. It was not death. It was not life. It was waiting. Valdor was gone. None knew where. Some claimed he had walked into the vaults below the throne and never emerged. Others whispered that he had taken a secret path into the stars to prepare for a threat even greater than Horus. A few suspected he had simply disappeared, a soul too burdened by what had come to pass. Whatever the truth, his absence carved a hollow space that could never be refilled. In the days that followed, the Custodians returned to Terra fully. No longer scattered across the stars, no longer observers of the legions. They closed ranks. They shut the gates. They turned inward. They were no longer warriors of the Imperium. They were its last sentries. This withdrawal was not immediate. It was slow, deliberate, like a man stepping into a cold sea 1 inch at a time. Patrols were recalled, embassies abandoned. The final Custodian envoys left the distant worlds without a word. There was no proclamation, no declaration of new purpose, only silence. And the silence became their armor. Outside, the Imperium struggled to rebuild. The High Lords of Terra seized control, not from ambition, but necessity. With the Emperor locked in stasis, his word could no longer guide policy. His light still shone through the Astronomicon, and that alone became proof enough that he lived, that his will endured. But no one could speak to him. No one could ask his guidance, except the Custodians. And yet, they said nothing. They would not interpret his will. They would not guess at his mind. They would not allow themselves to speak for him, because they had known him. They had walked at his side. They had heard his words with unfiltered truth. And because of that, they knew. Anyone who claimed to speak for the Emperor was already a liar. So they watched. The halls of the inner palace darkened. Corridors that once housed scholars and scientists fell empty. Statuaries of Primarchs, once luminous with reverence, were veiled. The libraries of the Sigillite were sealed in vaults too deep for memory. And still the Custodians stood. In gilded armor, they patrolled silent corridors. Some did not speak for decades. Their rituals became sacred. Movements measured to the second. Meditations calibrated to reduce mental drift. Weapons cleaned not out of need, but because discipline was all that remained. They became monuments, living relics. But they were not idle. The blood games continued. Even in the hollow years after the siege, the Custodians tested Terra's defenses relentlessly. They disguised themselves, infiltrated the palace, probed weaknesses. One would play the traitor, the saboteur, the assassin. The others would hunt him down. Not to punish, but to learn. And they always learned. One game nearly succeeded. A Custodian known only as Serac infiltrated the Hall of Judgment, wearing the guise of a rogue diplomat from Segmentum Solar. It took 12 days before he was discovered by another custodian who had noticed that Sirach's stride was precisely 3.4 centimeters shorter than it had been during his last assignment. That was enough. Afterward, both were commended, in silence. The Sisters of Silence, too, faded from public sight. Many returned to the vaults, others vanished into the stars, seeking out rogue psychers and unclean knowledge. They and the Custodians spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in brief, formal signs, an old language for a world that no longer had time for conversation. But not all Custodians endured the stillness without cost. Some began to question, quietly, inwardly. Not the Emperor, never the Emperor, but the Imperium, the mechanisms now running the galaxy, the High Lords who issued edicts in his name, the administratum that bloated like a wounded beast, the Inquisition that began to define heresy with ever-sharpening blades. The Custodians watched, but they did not interfere, until one did. It was in the 1000th year of the Age of the Throne when a Custodian named Aristane Galus disappeared from his post. He left no message, no signs of duress, no blood. Just a clean, empty armory locker and a data slate with the words, "The Imperium is not him." He was hunted for years, sighted across Segmentum Pacificus, reported near the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. He was never captured. Some say he had lost faith, others say he had found clarity. But the 10,000 did not speak of him again. Through all of this, the Emperor sat, and the Custodians stood. Generations passed, civilizations rose and fell. Wars were fought in his name, millions died for words he had never said. Chapels were built around the palace like tumors of reverence. Pilgrims wept at the outer gates, hoping to be allowed one glimpse of the throne from miles away. But the Custodians did not open the gates. They did not care for devotion. They did not care for faith. Their duty was not to the Imperium, it was to the Emperor. And he had not moved. Centuries blurred. The Imperium changed. It hardened, became colder, crueler. It choked on its own contradictions. It needed the Custodians to join it on its battlefields, in its councils, in its politics. But the 10,000 refused, until the day came when that refusal was no longer enough, until the enemies that crept in from the darkness became too numerous, too vile, too ancient. And the Custodians who had waited for millennia in golden silence began to stir. Not because the Imperium asked, but because they had seen what was coming. The long vigil was ending. The blades were being drawn once more. There is a difference between stillness and sleep. For over 10,000 years, the Custodians stood vigil at the heart of the Imperium. The outer galaxy burned, shifted, rebuilt, and tore itself apart in endless cycles of violence. But the 10,000 did not move. They guarded the Golden Throne, tested the walls of the Imperial Palace, and watched, always watched, as the galaxy lost sight of the truth they once protected. And yet stillness is not surrender. Silence is not weakness. The blade that waits is always sharper than the one already drawn. When Guilliman returned from the void, newly risen from stasis, bearing the Emperor's light like a torch stolen from time, the Custodians did not kneel. They did not lower their heads. They stood as they had always stood, as they had once stood even before Guilliman was found, before the legions were named, before the stars were reclaimed. He looked upon them not as soldiers, but as reminders. They were what he remembered and what the galaxy had forgotten. The Imperium he returned to was a corpse machine of bureaucracy and blind zealotry. Faith had replaced strategy. Dogma had replaced doctrine. The Emperor's image was carved into every cathedral, chanted in every breath. But none who spoke his name had ever heard his voice. But the Custodians had. They alone bore the weight of knowing what he truly was and what he was not. It was Guilliman who gave the order. The Imperium needs you. Not just your vigilance, but your presence. Terra must not be the tomb of the Golden Giants. You are needed out there. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Custodians walked beyond the bounds of the palace walls. The galaxy trembled. They did not march as an army. They did not raise banners or parade through the void. They emerged like the judgment they had always embodied, swift, precise, and unrelenting. The Indomitus Crusade had begun, but within it was something else, something deeper. Not a war of reclamation, but of correction, of clarity. For 10 millennia, the Imperium had warped under the pressure of its own survival. Whole planets dedicated themselves to hollow worship. Ecclesiarchs preached divine myths in the Emperor's name, transforming a secular truth into a theocratic labyrinth of rituals and offerings. Even the Adeptus Astartes, those once thought closest to him, had become dogmatic and tribal, each chapter twisting into its own subculture of reverence and rebellion. The Custodians saw it all, and they did not approve. On Vanax Prime, they arrived at a shrine world ruled by a cult that worshipped a speaking icon they believed to be the voice of the Emperor himself. Millions had died constructing a golden effigy that dripped synthetic tears and emitted static that the priests interpreted as divine speech. When the Custodians entered the sanctum, they said nothing. They examined the machine. They analyzed the transmissions. Then they tore it down in silence. The High Priestess begged for explanation. She was answered with a single phrase. He does not speak through toys. On the forge world of Vornar Mechanis, a corrupted sect of the Adeptus Mechanicus had begun producing blessed relics, supposedly powered by shards of the Golden Throne itself. When Custodians arrived, the Archmagos demanded proof that they held the Emperor's authority. He was dead before he finished the sentence. The forges were shut down, the secrets erased. They did not come to ask permission. They came to restore truth. But it was not only false worship they confronted. It was the truth of warfare itself. On the frontier world of Calyx 6, overrun by a splinter of the Tyrannid Hive fleets, the local Imperial Guard garrison had held out for 6 years under impossible conditions. When the Custodians arrived, they did not reinforce the trenches. They walked directly into the heart of the swarm. One strike team of 4 warriors entered a hive structure the size of a mountain. No support, no artillery, no retreat. Within 6 hours, the Tyrannid synapse web in the region collapsed. The horde scattered. The guard did not even see them leave. Their methods were surgical, cold. They did not revel in war. They treated battle as a necessary disease to be cut out and cauterized. But more than this, they began to speak. Not in sermons, not in proclamations, but in presence, in action, in correction. The people of the Imperium had forgotten what the Emperor's purpose had been. Not to be worshipped, but to uplift. Not to enslave through faith, but to liberate through truth, reason, and order. The Custodians knew this, and now as they moved across the stars again, they began to remind others. Not with words, but with the weight of their silence. Even the Astartes, once distant brothers in arms, felt the shift. Custodians began appearing at chapter keeps, walking through fortress monasteries like the echo of ancient judgment. Some chapters welcomed them with reverence, others with suspicion, but none could ignore their presence. At the gates of the Black Templars' fortress on Helios Tertius, a lone custodian stood for 3 days without speaking. When finally acknowledged by the chapter master, he offered a single sentence. "You carry his name, but not his burden." Then he turned and left. The implication lingered like a scar, but even as they corrected the Imperium, the Custodians knew the true threat had never left. The galaxy groaned under the weight of chaos. Xenos empires grew fat on Imperial blood. The cicatrix maledictum, a scar across reality itself, split the Imperium in half. The warp screamed louder than ever. Demons spilled into real space like infection, and still the Emperor did not speak. But he watched through the eyes of his custodians, and now they moved with greater purpose. Whispers spoke of secret missions behind the lines of traitor-held space, entire warbands of chaos, space marines vanishing without explanation, Eldar seers meeting golden figures beneath stars long dead, only to disappear themselves, custodians walking alone into infested cities and emerging without a scratch. They were not fighting for victory, they were fighting for foundation, because while the rest of the Imperium warred over territory, over heresy, over scraps of faith and ruins of planets, the 10,000 remembered the one thing that mattered: the Emperor's dream. Not the dogma that grew in his absence, not the cults that painted his face on their walls, but the actual vision he had once dared to build. They were not his sons, they were his legacy. And legacies do not fade, they endure. The Custodians had returned to the galaxy, not as heroes, not as conquerors, but as the silent truth behind every lie, as the gold that does not tarnish, as the Emperor's shadow once more cast across the stars. And this time, they would not be silent forever. They had always been one, 10,000 warriors bound by loyalty, bred for singular purpose, forged to be indivisible. The Adeptus Custodes had never needed diversity because perfection, they believed, did not require deviation. But the galaxy changed, and even perfection in time must adapt. When the Custodians stepped back into the stars, they did not return as a single entity. They returned as many. Shield hosts, once a ceremonial distinction, began to emerge as operational realities, each one a new facet of the Emperor's will, honed for a galaxy that no longer resembled the one he had tried to build. They were not chapters. They were not cults. They were not formed through rivalry, ambition, or brotherhood. They were instruments, pure, calculated, necessary, born not from divergence but precision. Each shield host was a response, a solution to a specific kind of threat. The galaxy did not bleed from one wound, it bled from 1,000, and each wound required its own blade. The Aquiline shield was the first to step forward, where the Imperium had faltered, where its heroes were hunted in shadow, where commanders were cut down in ambushes and assassins slipped through planetary defenses like poison through a vein. The Aquiline shield appeared, not in force but in silence. Their purpose was singular: protection. They did not defend walls. They defended people, not generals, not politicians. Individuals chosen by the Emperor's own fate, those whose survival was calculated to be of greater worth than the death of 1,000 enemies. On Cyros Delta, a Forge Lord of the Mechanicus discovered a pre-Imperial STC fragment that could double the efficiency of plasma reactors. Within hours, he became a target. Heretic cults rose from the depths. Chaos warbands changed course. Even rogue inquisitors questioned whether such power should exist. Then the Aquiline shield arrived. 3 custodians. No words, no warning. They stood beside the Forged Lord for 78 days. The assassination attempts never reached him, not even once. When the threat had passed, they left with no farewell, their golden footprints the only proof they had ever been there. Elsewhere, the emissaries Imperatus took form, where diplomacy had become a battlefield, where the Imperium's word had become fractured or forgotten. They walked, tall, golden, and unshakable, not ambassadors, but reminders. They did not negotiate, they clarified. One appeared before the ruling conclave of Hive Medrax, where the planetary governor had refused to send tithe regiments for over a decade. The Hive had justified their absence with legal arguments, bureaucratic stalling, claims of self-sufficiency, and localized emergencies. The emissary listened. Once. Then he presented the edict, a data slate with a single sentence. Your duty is not a question. When the next guard transport left Medrax's docks, it carried the full complement, and the governor's empty throne. But not all hosts were so visible. The Shadow Keepers had always existed, though few in the Imperium had ever heard their name. They were not just guards of the vaults beneath Terra, they were the executioners of what should never be spoken. There are prisons beneath the Imperial Palace, so ancient that even the oldest Mechanicus data stacks list them only as black parameters. Vaults that hold not people, but things. Beasts that had been forgotten for good reason. Xenos, relics too dangerous to study. Fragments of failed gods. The locks on these doors are not mechanical. They are oaths, and the Shadow Keepers are the keys. But as the Imperium fractures, even containment is no longer enough. Some threats escape, some are stolen, some are unleashed by accident or design, and when they emerge, the Shadow Keepers come for them. They wear no heraldry. Their faces are masked in black adamant. Their auramite is scorched and dulled. They are custodians, stripped of identity, stripped of name. Their duty is not glory. It is erasure. On Halakar's moon, a sorcerer of the Word-Bearers unearthed a sliver of the night that crawls, a warp entity that had once devoured an entire star system during the Age of Strife. The sorcerer believed he could bind it. He was mistaken. Before the entity could consume a second world, the Shadow Keepers arrived. No records remain of that mission, only a silence where a moon once was. And then there are the Solar Watch. They are motion, constant, unrelenting motion. They ride with the fleets. They walk the halls of void ships. They stand watch at the docking gates of the Segmentum command ships, cloaked in light. While other shield hosts act with intent, the Solar Watch acts with presence. Their golden jet bikes streak across battlefields in fire trails of speed and death. Their armor gleams not with polish, but from sheer exposure, every molecule worn smooth by atmospheric friction and warp dust. They are the Imperium's gleaming warning that the Emperor still watches, and that he moves faster than you think. On the death world of Colossus Prime, where tyrannid spores rained from the clouds, and the Guard were overwhelmed by wave after wave of Xenos, a single detachment of the Solar Watch cut through the horde. Not in days, not in hours, in minutes. They arrived in blinding flashes of transorbital descent, obliterated the synapse beasts, and were gone before the Guard had time to thank them. To the commanders of Colossus, it was a miracle. To the Solar Watch, it was Tuesday. Each shield host became a tool sharpened against the shape of the enemy. And behind them all, the companions. Not a host, not a company, a lineage. The companions are the Emperor's personal guard, the closest of the close. Even among the Custodians, they are sacred. They do not leave the throne room. They do not fight in wars. They stand watch, day and night, breath by breath. Each one trained from creation to read the Emperor's every flicker of will, to interpret the unspoken, the immobile. They can sense the shift in a breath, the weight of a silence, the shade of light in a dying eye. They are not warriors. They are proximity incarnate. If the Golden Throne fails, the companions are not there to save him. They are there to ensure that nothing can reach him as he dies. Not a god, not even hope. And yet, for all their divisions, all their duties, the shield hosts remain united by one truth. The galaxy is no longer what the Emperor tried to build. It is something else, something broken, something diseased. And the Custodians are not here to fix it. They are here to correct it, by scalpel or by fire. Each shield host is a reflection of the galaxy's rot. Each blade, a response to infection. Each warrior, a verdict passed without trial. Because the 10,000 were never meant to rule, They were meant to endure, to persist until the moment when the galaxy had lost all sense of what was real, what was divine, and what was simply necessary. That moment has come. The shield hosts awaken not to save the Imperium, but to remind it what it forgot. That judgment does not always come from above. Sometimes it walks beside you, and it is very, very patient. There is an assumption within the Imperium that its greatest threats come from without. The danger has a face: Xenos warlords, heretics cloaked in circuitry and sin, demons dripping malice from between the veil. That war is a distant thing, fought across the stars, contained by battle lines and faith, with names like Hive Fleet, Wa, or Black Crusade. But the Custodians know better. They have always known better. The greatest threat to the Emperor's vision was never beyond the gates of Terra. It was always within. Not traitors, not heretics, but those who claimed to serve him best. The Inquisition. The High Lords call them necessary. The Ecclesiarchy declares them holy. The Administratum swears by their authority in ink and blood. But to the Custodians, they are something far more dangerous. A flame burning too close to dry parchment. Because the Inquisition, above all other bodies, claims to know the Emperor's will. And the 10,000 cannot allow that claim to go unchecked. The Inquisition's origins were forged in desperation, born in the wake of the heresy, when Terra still smoldered and the galaxy reeled from betrayal. It was made to root out the rot before it took hold again. And in its earliest form, it did serve that purpose. It hunted the unclean. It destroyed the hidden cults. It silenced the whispers of chaos before they became screams. But centuries passed, then millennia, and the Inquisition did not fade. It grew, it fractured, it evolved into ordos and philosophies, into dogma layered on dogma. Some Inquisitors served truth, others served themselves, and through it all they acted in the Emperor's name. That, above all, was the sin. The Custodians, even in their long silence, had watched this unfold. They had records the Inquisition did not know existed, witnessed purges done for politics, exterminatus orders signed for pride. Worlds burned not because of heresy, but because of fear. There had been lines, and the Inquisition had crossed them. So when the 10,000 stepped once more beyond Terra, they did not only walk into battle, they walked into confrontation. Not open war, not yet, but conflict hidden in conversation, wrapped in ritual, veiled behind courtesy. It began on Salafan's Reach, a cardinal world, high seat of the Ministorum, and staging ground for an inquisitorial campaign against an alleged Xenos corruption spreading through its noble houses. When the Custodians arrived, the fires were already lit. The accused were being marched to the pyres, men, women, children. The Inquisitor in charge, Lord Hieront Zayli, welcomed the Custodians with words of alliance. They did not answer. They examined the evidence. They interviewed no one. They did not need to. Then they killed Zale, not in secret, not in vengeance. They executed him in the center of the procession square, before his retinue, before the ecclesiarchal choir. One stroke of a guardian spear, instant, unceremonious. The records from Salafan's Reach were sealed that day. The Inquisition never spoke of it again. But the Custodians had made their point. They were not servants of any branch of the Imperium, not of the Ministorum, not of the Inquisition. They were his, and no one spoke for him. There were consequences, not official ones. The Inquisition would never challenge the Custodians openly. To do so would be to admit the possibility of being wrong. But the tension grew like pressure behind ancient stone. On Harantax 9, a Custodian agent operating under the eyes of the Emperor was assassinated. Officially, it was blamed on Chaos cultists. Unofficially, the trail led to Ordo Hereticus intelligence operations. On the station of Kelban Halo, a detachment of Shadow Keepers was denied access to a vault by inquisitorial decree. The station's commander vanished 2 weeks later. No investigation was launched. It became a war of implication, of presence. The Custodians, for their part, did not escalate. They did not need to. They simply began appearing where they were least wanted. On the black ships, silent figures of gold began boarding without announcement, observing the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's rituals with unblinking attention. In inquisitorial conclaves, Custodians would appear in the corner of the chamber, speaking nothing, noting everything. When challenged, they did not explain. They simply waited. In time, Inquisitors began choosing their words more carefully. Because every one of them knew, they could call down the might of the Ordos, summon fleets, deploy stormtroopers, and mobilize purges with a gesture. But a Custodian would still be there, and he would not be impressed. There were those within the Inquisition who welcomed this. Radicals, yes, but also Puritans disillusioned with the growing rot. Inquisitor Thren of the Ordo Xenos once said, "The Custodians are not our rivals. They are our conscience given golden armor." She died 2 years later in a shuttle explosion. No foul play was ever confirmed, but the Custodians ensured her funeral was attended by 4 of their own, silently. They placed no banners. They spoke no words, but the message was heard. This slow-burning conflict has no front lines, no declarations, no banners raised in defiance. It is a cold tension felt in boardrooms and reliquaries, aboard warships and in data vaults. The Inquisition represents the Imperium's right to act without question. The Custodians are the reminder that no one is beyond question. Even now, the struggle deepens. Inquisitors whisper of interference, of Custodians appearing on worlds ahead of Ordo teams, of prisoners vanishing from secured transit ships, of warp-tainted artifacts being purged before they can be studied. And always, always the same words appear, carved in digital code or written in High Gothic. He does not speak through you. The High Lords do not intervene, not openly. They need both the Custodians and the Inquisition. One holds the walls, the other patrols the shadows. But both understand that only one speaks with the memory of the Emperor's voice. The tension cannot last forever. Something will break. Perhaps not today, perhaps not for centuries. But in the black silence of Terra's deepest vaults, the Custodians train for that moment. Not to destroy the Inquisition, not to save it, but to ensure that when that moment comes, the Imperium does not fall into ruin by the weight of its own delusions. Because the true enemy has never needed to breach the gates. It simply needs to convince those inside that it is already in charge. And the 10,000 will never allow that lie to stand. It had stood since the Age of Unification, a bastion hewn from the bones of mountains and crowned in radiant adamantium. The Lion's Gate spaceport was not just a structure, it was a symbol, a promise written in stone and reinforced with generations of unyielding blood, that no enemy, no matter how monstrous, would ever set foot upon the throne world uninvited. That promise was broken. In the darkest hours of the Imperium's history, during the Siege of Terra, the Lion's Gate had fallen. Mortarian's plague hosts had flooded its halls. The skies above it had turned black with ruin. Demons howled in its control towers. Loyalists bled and died by the tens of thousands to stem the tide, and still they were overrun. Though the Imperium survived, the Lion's Gate never truly recovered. The scars remained, burned into its walls, etched into its reputation. Repairs were made, defenses rebuilt, but something had changed. The gate had once welcomed gods. Now it trembled at the approach of nightmares. For 10,000 years it stood guarded, not abandoned, never unprotected, but not reclaimed either. The gate functioned, yes. Ships passed through its channels, pilgrims knelt in its outer halls, administratum transports crawled through its veins like insects. But it no longer roared with pride. The Custodians had watched this decline in silence, not because they were unwilling, but because their duty kept them rooted elsewhere, within the sanctum, at the throne, beside the husk of the Emperor whose breath still tethered the Imperium to life. But that changed. The Indomitus Crusade had drawn many of the Custodians back into the galaxy. Shield hosts deployed far and wide. The 10,000, for the first time in ages, were spread thin. And Terra, once the most protected world in existence, began to feel it. When the traitor forces returned, they struck not with banners and fleets, but with infiltration, subterfuge, and whispers. The Lion's Gate was compromised from within. At first, it seemed like inefficiency. Misrouted cargo, delayed clearance for orbital landers, vox static corrupting communications from the segmentum solar fleets. But then came the disappearances. Tech priests vanished from sealed cogitator chambers. Unitorum officers found torn apart in rooms locked from the inside. An entire detachment of Skitari sent to investigate sub-level Gamma-6 went silent. By the time the truth was uncovered, it was already too late. A Genestealer cult had rooted itself deep beneath the gate. They had grown there like rot beneath gold, festering for decades, perhaps centuries, feeding on bureaucracy, on blind ritual, on the noise of a bloated Imperium too vast to hear its own death rattle. And now they were ready. When they rose all at once. Entire sub-levels detonated from within. Control towers were seized in under 5 minutes. The hangar districts fell to chaos as corrupted defense servitors turned on loyal personnel. Astra Militarum forces garrisoned nearby were slaughtered in their barracks, throats slit by comrades who had worn their faces for years. The call went out for aid. The response did not come from the High Lords. It did not come from the Guard. It came from beneath the throne. The Custodians moved. They did not ask for command. They did not send fleets. They did not warn the enemy. They descended like judgment. The emissaries Imperatus took the main concourse, their golden forms silent beneath flickering arc lumen. Cultists surged to meet them, some carrying rusted autoguns, others with limbs warped by alien birthright, faces filled with rapture. They died by the hundreds. Each emissary fought like a force of nature. Every movement was a lesson in precision. One swing, one kill. No excess, no waste. The Solar Watch struck from above, auric jet bikes streaking through the sky, raining death into the cult-held bastions. They landed on landing pads, crawling with xeno-tainted hybrids, and cleared them in seconds. They did not hold ground. They purified it, burned the heresy from the metal, then moved on before the ash settled. But the core infection was deeper still. And so the Shadow Keepers were unleashed. They descended into the depths of the gate, into maintenance corridors, half-flooded sublevels, and ventilation shafts laced with organic growth. They moved like wraiths, blades drawn, armor scorched matte black. There were no orders, no signals, only the steady hum of null wards and the pulse of unseen horrors in the dark. They found the Patriarch at the heart of the infection, a towering creature, part human, part nightmare, all malevolence, bathed in the psionic haze of its brood. It hissed not with fear, but triumph. Its children surrounded it in a frenzy of devotion, ready to die in worship of the thing they called Father, Prophet King. They died screaming. The Shadow Keepers did not speak. They did not hesitate. They carved a path through the cult's final chamber, like a scalpel through diseased flesh. When the Patriarch struck back, lashing with talons and thoughts of pain, it found nothing to corrupt, no fear to feed on, no doubt to twist, only golden stillness and the certainty of duty. The final blow came not with fanfare, but with focus. A guardian spear plunged through the creature's spine and into the stone beneath. Silence followed. The gate was reclaimed. But the custodians did not celebrate. They did not raise banners or deliver speeches. They simply walked the halls, one by one, room by room, until every inch of the Lion's Gate had been purified. And then they stayed. Not for days, not for weeks, for months. Custodians stood watch on every tier of the structure, atop its towers, within its hangars, beside the great adamantine doors through which the Emperor himself once walked. They polished its walls, recalibrated its defense grids, inspected every shrine, every cogitator, every lumen circuit. The Imperium had forgotten what the Lion's Gate meant. The Custodians had not. When it was done, they rededicated it, not with ritual, but with presence. One by one, shield captains from every host walked its halls. The Sisters of Silence held a silent vigil in the re-sanctified chapel of the gate. Even the companions sent an envoy, one of their own, nameless and wordless, who stood at the central command dais for 99 days, unmoving, and then left without explanation. The Lion's Gate now breathes again. It is not just functional, it is sacred. But sacred not in the sense the ecclesiarchy would claim, not a temple to blind worship, but a stronghold of intention, of vigilance, a living testament that Terra is not just a throne, but a fortress. And though the war is far from over, though darkness still coils beyond the stars, and rot still pulses within, one thing is certain. No enemy will take the Lion's Gate again. Not while the 10,000 remain. Not while the blades of the Emperor still gleam in the halls he once walked. Not while the gate stands guarded by those who do not forget, because some doors are not meant to open, and some guardians do not forgive. Gathalamor had always been a place of paradox, a shrine world in the segmentum solar, wreathed in the smoke of endless incense, its sky scarred with the contrails of devotional processions, its soil blackened by the bootsteps of a billion pilgrims who came seeking miracles and found only ash and doctrine. It was holy. It was haunted. And like so many places in the Imperium, it was teetering on the edge of becoming something else. The ecclesiarchy claimed Gathalamor as one of its crown worlds, its basilica towers reaching for the stars like the limbs of starving saints. Monuments of bone and gold covered its surface, cathedrals the size of cities, ossuaries filled with the relics of thousands of martyrs, war priests screaming litanies into winds choked with ash. It was a world that screamed its faith into the void, with such force that the void finally screamed back. The rupture began in whispers, a relic unearthed from beneath the basilica of the Crimson Star, a chalice, black and humming, engraved with symbols that twisted the eye and sickened the mind. The priests who uncovered it claimed it bled light, that it whispered secrets about the Emperor's final moments, that it showed them visions of the God Emperor unshackled, speaking in tongues older than language. The first to drink from it tore out his own eyes and proclaimed the coming of the living revelation. The second immolated himself and walked, still burning, into the high chapel. The third became something else entirely. By the time the Imperium realized the truth, it was already too late. The relic was not a miracle. It was a gate, and Gathalamor was no longer just a shrine world, it was a wound. A rift tore through the skies above the basilica, a storm of unreality blooming like rot in open air. The warp bled into real space in waves of sickened light and molten shadow. Pilgrims turned into maniacs, priests twisted into things that wore vestments like skin. Towers that had stood for centuries screamed and collapsed into themselves, replaced by monuments of living bone and molten brass. A demon prince strode from the breach, its name unpronounceable to human tongues, a creature that once may have been mortal, a cardinal who had seen the truth and torn his soul free in celebration. He bore a crozier of tongues, his wings composed of flayed saints, and wherever his gaze fell, Belief twisted into blasphemy. The Astra Militarum mobilized. The Sisters of Battle launched purging crusades from orbit. The Ordo Malleus sanctioned exorcists and fire teams, but Gathalamor swallowed them all. Then the Custodians came. They did not arrive in strength. No grand army, no world-burning force. Just 30 warriors of the 10,000, each bearing a name spoken only once, each clad in armor that had never tasted failure. They arrived not to reclaim the planet, but to end it. Leading them was Shield Captain Darnath Sirokt, a veteran of the Webway War and one of the rare few who had stood within the Emperor's presence and retained memory of it. His face bore no expression, his words were few, his orders absolute. Their descent was unceremonious, no banners, no trumpets, no cries of salvation, just 30 lances of gold slamming into a world that no longer recognized its own flesh. The Custodians stepped onto Gathalamor, not as liberators, but as executioners. The demons came first, screaming, flailing, dripping with the matter of madness and hunger, entities of excess and rage, phantasms of despair made solid by prayer turned inward. They fell like rain, clawing at the Custodians with claws of liquid agony and breath of rot. None reached striking distance. The Custodians formed a wedge, advancing through the outer districts of the ravaged city with inhuman calm. Their guardian spears sang in the warp-thick air, each strike severing not just flesh, but soul. Demons vanished in clouds of psychically charged fire. Buildings warped by unreality collapsed into stillness as the null aura of their advance erased the warp's influence. They spoke not to each other. They did not need to. They had trained together for centuries. They were one will, one purpose. Their goal was the relic, the chalice, and the thing guarding it. The demon prince waited at the core of the basilica, surrounded by a court of warp spawn. Lesser princes, corrupted priests, and twisted echoes of saints rebuilt from corrupted belief. It sang as the Custodians approached, its voice like molten silver poured over broken glass. Every word tried to twist into prophecy, to fill the Custodians' ears with promises and untruths. But they had walked through the webway. They had heard worse. The final battle was not prolonged. It was precise. 3 Custodians died, slain not by claws, but by the sheer pressure of the demonic prince's presence. Their souls extinguished before their hearts stopped beating. Another was consumed in a pillar of screaming light, his body vanishing as he recited the Emperor's name in a voice as steady as stone. But they did not falter. Darnath Sirokt met the demon in the sanctum itself, beneath a ceiling of skin-stretched frescoes depicting a future that would never come. He did not curse it. He did not denounce it. He did not debate. He simply drove his guardian spear through its chest, whispered a word taught to him by the Emperor before the heresy, and watched it unravel. The chalice shattered, not with a bang, not with glory. It cracked quietly, and the warp screamed in retreat. Gathalamor was not saved. It could never be saved. The Custodians did not leave. They stayed, for days, weeks. Every inch of the world was scoured, burned, blessed, cleansed, not by ecclesiarchal right, but by the Custodians' own authority, older than any church, deeper than any psalm. They pulled every trace of the warp into themselves, letting it rage harmlessly against golden will until it sputtered and died. When they left, they did not say what would happen next, but the orbital fleet received one simple transmission. This world is sealed. No landfall, no worship, no return. It was obeyed. Gathalamor remains today a forbidden place. Its surface is lifeless. Its cathedrals reduced to shattered husks. Its monuments melted into slag, but it is not abandoned. At the edge of its orbit, a single Custodian ship remains, watching, because the galaxy burns in many places. But belief, misplaced, weaponized belief, burns the hottest of all. And the 10,000 will never allow that fire to spread unchecked again. There is a silence in the Imperial Palace that no hymn can reach. Not the echo of reverent footfalls, not the chanting of adepts or the static hum of vox prayers. It is deeper than the vaults, more ancient than the stones. It is the stillness that surrounds the golden throne, the eye of the storm that has lasted 10,000 years. Here the Emperor sits, here the Custodians stand. And as the galaxy fractures anew, as the darkness grows teeth and the light flickers in the heart of mankind, they remember. Because their story does not end with a war, it does not conclude with glory or fire, it does not seek a final battle, a last charge, a thunderous martyrdom. The Custodians were never made to die in legend, they were made to endure. And in endurance they find their final oath. It was spoken before they bore armor, before they wielded guardian spears, before the galaxy knew them as giants in gold. It was not an oath of conquest or loyalty, but of stewardship, of protection, of preservation, not of territory, but of vision. The Emperor did not create them to win wars. He created them to be the last truth left standing when the lies burned away. Now, across a galaxy split by the cicatrix maledictum, that truth is more vital than ever. A galaxy torn in half, Imperium nihilus, cut off from the Astronomicon, drowning in endless night. The Imperium sanctus, still clinging to the faint pulse of the throne's light. The warp bleeds more freely than it ever has. Demons dance across worlds once thought safe. Entire sectors vanish from the star charts like breath on glass. And yet, amid it all, the Custodians walk. Not as conquerors, not even as warriors, as reminders. On the war-torn world of Brine's Hollow, where a fragment of Hive Fleet Leviathan has merged with the detritus of chaos corruption, a force of Custodians appears not from orbit, but from silence. Teleportation not registered by any fleet. No signal, no warning. The last Vox capture of the world shows a sister of battle, wounded, standing in defiance before a monstrous hybrid of gene stealer and demon. She looks up as the hybrid is bisected mid-charge. A golden warrior, faceless and burning, steps forward and simply says, "You've done enough." Brain's Hollow is cleared in 3 hours. There are no survivors. There is no record of their departure. Across Segmentum Tempestus, word spreads of the spectral gold, Custodians who no longer wear brilliant auramite, but blackened, scarred plate. They travel aboard a ship without a name, its registry lost in ancient code. They do not respond to hails. They arrive only in places where things are worse than war, where reality itself begins to twist, where time skips and language collapses, where chaos is not just present, but nested in the bones of the world. These Custodians do not come to liberate. They come to unmake. A forge world overrun by the disciples of a dark mechanicum magos is not reclaimed. It is erased, atomized by a singularity weapon known only to the vaults beneath the throne. A hive spire infected with a mimetic plague that causes worship of a false emperor is collapsed from orbit. Entire city blocks are excised with surgical orbital fire. No warning, no explanation. This is the final oath. The Custodians, once sworn to protect the Emperor, now serve a deeper burden, to protect his vision even from his own creation. And that means there are things that must never spread. Faith has become a contagion. Ritual has become a mask. The Imperium worships a corpse, and though the Custodians will not destroy it, neither will they feed it. They walk the narrow line between reality and religion, not out of pride, but because no one else can. In the Hall of Echoes beneath the palace, a chamber sealed for over 5 millennia is reopened. Inside, data vaults flicker to life. The faces of long-dead Primarch's commanders, scholars appear in hollow still, frozen at the moment they last spoke to the Emperor. The Custodians enter one by one, offering no prayer. They watch, they remember, and then they leave. Because remembrance for them is not a comfort, it is a burden, a compass. Every step they take now is weighted with what was lost and what must never be repeated. The galaxy begs for saviors. The ecclesiarchy sings of vengeance. The Astartes speak of duty. The Inquisition whispers of absolution through flame. But the Custodians speak only through presence. They are not legends. They are limits. When a rogue Astartes chapter proclaims itself the divine heirs to the Emperor's soul, converting 3 systems to their own doctrine, the Custodians answer, not with legions, but with a message. One Custodian arrives at the peak of the chapter's stronghold. He walks through lace fire and auto-cannon barrage, silent, unscathed. At the gates, he speaks. The Emperor is not yours to define. By morning, the chapter no longer exists. No report is filed, no names recorded. The final oath does not require recognition. And as the galaxy spirals further, as Guilliman tightens the reins of Imperium governance, as even the defenders of Terra feel the pressure of the universe's slow collapse, the Custodians hold the line. Not just the walls, not just the golden throne, but the truth of what was, and perhaps what still could be. Some speak of a second great rift coming, a final sundering of the veil between warp and matter, the end of all structure, the death of time. The Custodians do not fear it, because their oath was not to a timeline, not to an empire. Their oath was to the Emperor, the man, not the myth. And if the final hour does come, if the last star dims and the throne's light goes out, there will be one warrior standing in that blackness, unmoving, unbent, golden still, though no light remains to reflect it. And he will speak, not to be heard, but because duty demands it. He is not gone. He is remembered. That is the oath that endures. And that is why the 10,000 will never fall.